I'm Laura Lucas Magnuson, and this is The World Unpacked. In today's special surprise edition of the podcast, we're talking about the future of the Middle East after COVID as part of Carnegie's new digital magazine out today. Read The Day After, Navigating a Post-Pandemic World at carnegieendowment.org/thedayafter.
Every country has homegrown grievances, but the demonstrators share some deep-seated frustrations. Mostly, they're young. More than 60% of the population in the Middle East is under 30. And they're angry, fed up with unemployment.
ظرف چند هفته آینده در مقابله با این ویروس پیروز خواهیم شد. مطمئن باشید که ما کرونا رو شکست میدیم. مطمئن.
That's the Deputy Health Minister in Iran who has the virus.
Let's turn our attention to Yemen now, which last week marked 5 years of conflict, a deadly proxy war between the Saudi-led coalition and Iran-backed Houthi forces, which has left millions suffering. In fact,
Lebanon's debt-laden economy was already mired in crisis and reeling from the coronavirus pandemic before the port explosion.
When faced with the question, what will happen next? Will people persevere? Will they just give up? I think that it's not really a choice anymore. They have no other choice but to do something so something changes.
Kim Ghattas is a non-resident senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She is also the author of Black Wave, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the 40-year rivalry that unraveled culture, religion, and collective memory in the Middle East. Thanks for joining us, Kim.
Thanks for having me, Laura.
So, Kim, the Middle East has been hit with a series of transformative shocks over the past decade. The 2011 Arab Spring, 2014 decline in oil prices, the 2019 resurgence of protest movements, and more recently, the coronavirus pandemic. Let's talk very broadly about the countries of the region and how they're faring, which countries have done well and which countries have not really met expectations.
Overall, it felt as though the Middle East got quite lucky initially when the pandemic hit in March. It looked like for once the Middle East could go through a world crisis without bearing the brunt of it. Overall, most countries did okay, particularly because, as I said, the number of cases were not that high. Mm-hmm. And the country that was hit the most in the region at first was, of course, Iran, which is partly where the pandemic first started spreading. And there were all these headlines about Iran being the epicenter.
And we saw senior officials themselves contract COVID, actually, early on, yes.
Absolutely. Since then, it's gotten worse. The situation has gotten worse. It looks definitely like there is this sort of second wave coursing through the region. Although I have to say that the Middle East, even today, as numbers are rising, is still doing better than the United States, than Brazil, than India, among others. There are differences between how each country is tackling it and what are the considerations that each country is taking in its approach. You have countries like Iraq or Lebanon or even Egypt that have seen the pandemic as an opportunity to further crush protests or dissent by imposing lockdowns or stopping protests from taking place. You have countries like Gulf countries where today the number of per capita infection is quite high. 86,000 in Kuwait, for example, in a population of 4 million. That's quite high. In comparison, you have a country like Lebanon where things do feel like they're unraveling, but actually comparatively, the Lebanese authorities and Lebanese civil society have managed to keep it somewhat under control, despite everything that Lebanon is dealing with. And I know we're going to talk about this in a bit as well. The number of cases is 18,000 out of a population of about 5 million. And the number of deaths is still in the low hundreds. So comparatively to the region, that's still okay. Every death is one death too many. And then you have Iraq, where you've had 7,000 deaths so far.
So just like the rest of the world, a huge variety in the way that countries are being impacted and responding. And how is the pandemic impacting conflict zones like Syria and Yemen?
That's the biggest difference. That's the biggest sort of unequalizer. I mean, in a way, the pandemic has been the great equalizer around the world. Everyone has been hit more or less. Every population has suffered either from the economic impact or the high number of deaths, but it has also, in all countries, fed further inequality within the country. And in some regions like the Middle East, it has fed further inequalities, not just within the country, but in between countries. So you've had rising number of cases in Gulf countries and therefore also rising number of deaths. But Gulf countries are rich enough that they have the health system, the healthcare that is adequate to some extent or to a great extent to deal with high hospitalization, number of beds, ICUs, etc. But then you have countries like the ones you mentioned, Libya, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, that already are going through conflict crises, whose health systems are either partially or completely devastated. And in these countries, you can't really tell whether it is spreading unchecked, whether it is actually under control because the official numbers are low, or whether it is simply being underreported. So in Libya, we've had 15,000 cases. That's quite high. But in Syria, we only have 2,000. I find that hard to believe. In Yemen, only 2,000 official cases. I find that hard to believe as well. So a lot of the cases are going underreported. That's the assessment of health officials, also from the World Health Organization and local officials. Countries like Yemen and Syria not only have healthcare systems that are devastated, but they're, in the case of Yemen in particular, have to deal with other health crises like cholera and also hunger. To be brutally honest, people must be reminded of the hunger and the malnourishment that is taking hold in Yemen. And these inequalities are there to stay for a while and are not being addressed because they're not being addressed properly. They weren't being addressed properly before, and they're certainly not going to be addressed properly now. And this has a multiplier effect on so many aspects of society, from education, from the health of children, from potential for growth in the future. It's devastating.
Right. I mean, that's where we've seen the pandemic have an impact, even if cases aren't so high, is that it's sort of an accelerant to other trends that are happening, or attention on it displaces attention on other very serious issues, including the ones that you just mentioned.
Absolutely, Laura. I mean, I just think about the number of children who've missed school for the last few months, since March, whose futures are going to be terribly impacted by this. Worldwide, 1 billion children have been at home since March. And in some cases, they've had access to online education, but in many cases, they have not. And that is not only in developing countries. Read the stories about young people not being able to access Zoom classes in Italy or in the US because there's no internet at home or there's no laptop. This is really happening everywhere. But in countries where, on top of that, you have war, strife, conflict, derelict education systems, derelict health systems, it just makes it all even worse.
And you mentioned Lebanon. You know, that has really dominated the news since the very tragic blast in the port of Beirut in early August. What is the feeling on the ground in Lebanon at the moment? And can you talk a little bit more about how COVID plays into that, or maybe not, as you said, right now?
So Lebanon seemed to be dealing quite well with the pandemic so far, up until about July, when it reopened the airport, because it depends on travelers, tourists, expatriates coming into the country. And then the number of cases started rising. But up until then, and even to this day, although people are very worried and very concerned about how things might unravel if the health systems and the hospitals are overtaxed, the pandemic still seems to be somewhat contained. Somewhat. Again, the numbers are not alarming per capita, but they're not good. The trend is not good. So in Lebanon, you've had almost a year of protests. You've had devaluation of the currency. You've had unofficial capital controls. You've had rising food prices, rapidly rising poverty. Then comes the pandemic, compounding all of that. Imagine an economic shutdown in an economy that is already sort of grinding to a halt. And then, on top of that, you get this awful, massive explosion on August 4th, which devastates large parts of the eastern sector of the city by the port, adds yet another burden on hospitals, 2 or 3 of which were almost entirely damaged, 6,000 people in hospital, some of them with life-threatening injuries, 200 people dead, several still missing, and 300,000 people instantly homeless. Now, society has an incredible ability to rise to its feet in this country and step in where the state fails again and again and again. So much of the rebuilding, much of the humanitarian aid is going through local NGOs, volunteer efforts, neighbors helping each other. It's just been astounding to see. But what it has meant for the pandemic is that a lot of people will tell you, we don't care about this pandemic anymore. We're dying anyway. So we might just as well dying trying to repair our houses and get the virus. We cannot stay at home. We cannot not work. We cannot afford it. We simply cannot care at the moment about this pandemic. Hospital officials will tell you, you can't do this. You must be a responsible citizen. You must wear a mask. You must maintain social distancing, because very soon the hospitals will not be able to cope. I know I'm painting a very grim picture. Things are rather depressing at the moment in Lebanon. Civil society, or rather opposition groups that have come out of the grassroots protest movement have not been able to really impose change other than bring down the cabinet. Now we have a new prime minister designate who will form a cabinet after the visit of French President Emmanuel Macron to Lebanon, who's really trying to force the political establishment in this country to take reforms seriously. I know this is not an episode about Lebanon, so I'll wrap it there by saying 2 things. What Lebanon has averted in the wake of August 4th is a further conflagration of violence on the streets for now, because of the initiative of President Macron. But the rise, what his initiative also does is give yet another lifeline to the political establishment. But it looks as though there's no other way forward at the moment. The other thing I will say about Lebanon is that although it's a tiny country, and of course I'm biased because I'm Lebanese, Lebanon matters to the region and to the world in so many ways that it is essential to keep an eye on it, not only from a security standpoint, not only because of the connections to Iran, because of the presence of Hezbollah, the political party militant group in Lebanon, but also because of the high number of refugees, Syrian and Palestinian, in the country, and because of rising poverty in Lebanon. The answer is not to build a wall around Lebanon and make sure that the problems don't spill out and that refugees don't leave to Europe. The answer is to look at this country in context, and make sure that somehow true reforms are possible and that there is a qualitative change in the way it forges a path forward.
We'll be back in a moment to talk about how the region's two main geopolitical rivals, Iran and Saudi Arabia, are viewing this moment. Kim, your recent book talks in detail about the origins of the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Let's talk a little bit about how these two countries are faring now. Saudi Arabia, for example, was hit hard by the global decline in demand for oil back in early March. And as we already mentioned, Iran was initially struggling to get the coronavirus under control. Where do they stand about 6 months later?
The impact of the pandemic on Saudi Arabia has been tremendous because not only have oil prices fallen, the kingdom, which is the custodian of the two holy sites in Islam, has also had to, in essence, cancel the pilgrimage.
Unprecedented.
Well, not unprecedented because it's happened in the past, but for this custodian of the two holy sites of Islam, from the House of Saud, it's been unprecedented to have to do that. And it's been unprecedented in its economic impact on the country. Saudi Arabia was expecting some 18 million Muslims to come for both the Hajj and the smaller pilgrimage, the Umrah, in 2020. That's not happening. By this year, Saudi Arabia was hoping that it could, live without oil, that it would raise non-oil revenues to $160 billion. That hasn't happened either. That is not a reaction or a consequence of the falling oil prices. That is a consequence of, if you want, the hubris of the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who launched these big headlines and big ideas about where he wanted to take the kingdom, but did not follow through properly in a sustained way, because there is a certain trap that the Saudis keep falling into of talking a big talk about reforms and moving away from oil over the last few decades. They've done this repeatedly, but never quite seizing the moment to do that. So now, having not been able to restructure the economy in a way that allows the kingdom to live without oil, they're now facing a deep income revenue shortcoming because of the drop in oil prices.
Will that change the sort of Vision 2030 plan?
Oh, absolutely. It will have to be cut back dramatically. And if it's not, then it shows again how disconnected from reality the ruling family is in Saudi Arabia, and namely Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. They're also keeping an eye on the region, on Iran, on the elections in the United States, how the outcome will affect them, depending on who the next president of the United States is going to be. So the impact of the pandemic has been mostly economic for Saudi Arabia. For Iran, not only are they still dealing with the impact of the pandemic with 378,000 cases and 21,000 deaths, they're also dealing with falling oil prices, the little bit of oil that they can still sell. They've been dealing with ongoing protests around the country for the last few years, and they keep appearing here and there. But they're also having to deal with increased pressure on them as a system, not only with the maximum pressure and the sanctions imposed by the US, but also by this series of, shall we say, unexplained explosions, attacks that have, or explosions that we think are sabotage attacks that have occurred over the last few weeks since July. Really a series of explosions in the Bushehr port, in the Natanz nuclear plant, etc., in Tehran, that really show how much pressure Iran is under.
And how do you I mean, I don't ask you to prognosticate, but someone who watches Iran closely, what are you looking for in terms of what's next for them, or the election in the United States? What are sort of your milestones to think about how they will be faring?
So Iran will have a presidential election next year, which the world will be watching closely. It will come right after the US election. Everyone is always watching to see whether there is going to be a breaking point in Iran, where the system fails, implodes, where there's a massive outpouring of protests on the street that bring down the system, whether another kind of breakdown would be sitting down at the table and acquiescing to all the conditions of the West, or at this moment in particular, the US. I don't really see that happening at the moment. I see more of the same. But again, I don't like to put out prognostics. I don't like to try to predict what is going to happen, because history really is full of surprises. And when I did my research for my book, and I looked at the years preceding 1979, really no one expected Iran to turn into an Islamic republic. And up until the moment where Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini came back from exile and in essence took over the revolution before he took over the country, no one thought that Ruhollah Khomeini would rise as the leader that he became. In fact, the CIA at the time saw in Khomeini a potential influence that would temper the ardors of the left, which at the time was, the West's big obsession. This was the time of the Soviet Union and the spread of communism. And the West was very concerned, as was Saudi Arabia, about the possibility that the Shah would be replaced by a pro-Soviet regime. So the CIA thought that the leftists who were really driving the revolution could potentially lead to a pro-Soviet regime, and therefore Khomeini and the clerics could help temper that. So I find it very hard. I always shy away from making big pronouncements. What I see is more of the same, including more continued pressure on Iran by Israel, by the US, and now by this sort of growing, some of it still unspoken, but some of it still now very official alliance between Israel and Gulf countries. We've just seen the peace agreement between Israel and the UAE. Saudi Arabia is not going to follow suit publicly, but there is intelligence sharing, and it's all about Iran.
And we've also obviously mentioned Lebanon, Iran being closely aligned with Hezbollah. Are the issues in Lebanon cause for concern in Tehran, or are there, as you said, a myriad of other issues that they're more focused on?
The Iranians are better than others at talking and chewing gum at the same time, as the American expression goes. They're not as omnipotent and powerful and strategic as some people like to believe. They often benefit from the ineptitude of their adversaries, but they're quite good at maintaining their course, at thinking strategically, and biding their time. Furthermore, they're also very good at buying time, not just biding their time, but buying time, and using chaos to their advantage. They are under tremendous pressure, and what they've had to deal with over the last 12 months or so is quite unusual. Protests in Lebanon, which were initially against the corrupt political establishment, but also very quickly included Hezbollah in that, because Hezbollah has become part of the political establishment in Lebanon. So protests in Lebanon that were indirectly threatening Iran. Protests in Iraq, where Iran was very much the direct target of the anger and the ire of protesters on the street. And protests in Iran at the same time. All of that was happening at the same time. And there was a chant on the streets of Beirut, from Tehran to Beirut, one revolution that does not die. من Tehran لا بيروت ثورة واحدة ما بتموت. So that was quite the challenge for them. And I think it was quite the challenge for Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force, the paramilitary arm of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, who was then killed in a targeted strike by the US in January. That has, caused some reshuffling of the deck, who is up or who is down. And so it's been just an ongoing series of moves to pressure Iran. But in Lebanon, the pandemic helped. It helped curb the protests. In Iran, the pandemic helped curb the protests. In Iraq as well. And now, with the latest moves in Lebanon by the French, President Macron's visit, but even by the US, I would say, the Iranians and Hezbollah have just bought themselves more time, because the international community is demanding reform, not wholesale change. It has put the issue of Hezbollah a little bit to the side as long as they allow reforms. And so the pressure is off just a little bit, but they're not out of the woods yet. And they're also, I think, going to be very concerned about how the next months unfold. And particularly, they'll be very concerned if President Trump wins, because they'll realize then that the pressure is only going to continue. Whereas if Joe Biden wins, there's more opportunity to buy time again with some kind of negotiations.
Have any of these challenges fundamentally shifted the balance of power between Saudi Arabia and Iran? You mentioned the upcoming U.S. election, for instance.
Unless there is a dramatic event within Iran or within Syria, or a dramatic event like a US strike or an Israeli strike, really overtly, not sabotage, against Iran, I don't see a shift in the power of balance between these two countries in the near future. Perhaps if a President Trump wins, there might be a crescendo of pressure on Iran with the help of Israel and the UAE and Saudi Arabia that could eventually lead Iran either towards negotiations with a very bad set of cards for Iran, with very little room to maneuver, or potentially an implosion within Iran from the pressure with an outburst of protests. I don't see that scenario under a Biden presidency, which is why, to be honest, it's important for listeners in the US or elsewhere to know that there are a lot of people around me who are hoping for a second mandate, for a second presidency, a second Trump presidency, regardless of the consequences for America or the rest of the world, because their focus is so much on Iran that they want the pressure on Iran to continue, and therefore they want a second Trump presidency. There are other things that could happen that could take us by surprise in Saudi Arabia. Mohammed bin Salman is young, and if he acceds to the throne, he could rule for 50 years. But it's a viper's nest, and he could face quite a few challenges in continuing to assert his power, both now or if he accedes to the throne later. So, barring an unexpected move like that, I see just more of the same, and no real change in the shift of in the balance of power between the two countries.
We'll be right back to look at how these current challenges might impact the region. Kim, this podcast is part of a larger Carnegie digital magazine called The Day After, Navigating a Post-Pandemic World, in which scholars from across our global network consider what's next, whether for the Arab world, on cybersecurity, or the future of U.S.-China relations. Obviously, we're a long way from a return to normalcy in that post-pandemic world we all seek, but what big questions should Arab governments be asking themselves now in terms of what's next?
Arab governments should be asking themselves the same questions that they should have been asking themselves over the last few decades. Do we want to continue to play silly power games, continue to hold on to power at all cost? Or do we want to serve our citizens and build productive societies that produce happy, productive citizens that can live with dignity, justice, and freedom of expression and jobs? I don't see that the pandemic has focused people's minds on these essential questions. What it has done is made it even more obvious to citizens, to people in the region, that their governments are not delivering for them. There are big issues that are not being addressed. The IMF estimates a very sharp contraction in economies in the Gulf by 4%. The dependence on migrant workers in the Gulf is going to have to be revisited, because travel isn't what it used to be. Migrant workers can't come and go. They've been stuck in the Gulf without pay. The way they've been treated has been absolutely atrocious, including and especially in Saudi Arabia. Migrant workers from Africa thrown in rooms, naked, half naked, barely fed, beaten up. This cannot be a way to build the economies of the 21st century. So I know it sounds almost basic and naive to say that Arab governments really need to ask themselves what kind of societies, what kind of nations they want to build in the 21st century.
And you've talked about the sort of pent-up frustration with political systems in different countries of the region, Lebanon being potentially the best example. The reforms that Lebanon needs to pursue, can those be applied more broadly in the region?
Oh, absolutely. With some differences. Obviously, the economy of the Gulf is not the economy of the MENA region. Saudi Arabia cannot be compared to Tunisia, and Lebanon cannot be compared even to Iraq. We have a very specific set of issues that we're having to deal with in Lebanon. But overall, it is about building meritocracies. It is about
education.
Education, absolutely. It is about social reforms. It is about freedom of expression. And overall, it is about moving away from corrupt politics and corrupt practices. And for the case of Lebanon, but also Iraq, it is about moving away from sectarian politics that are used and abused by countries like Iran, which has a foothold in both Lebanon and Iraq through the Shia community. There is so much that needs to be done in this region that it's hard to know where to start with. But I think that, again, not to sound Pollyannish or naive, I really hope that this pandemic focuses people's minds and governments' minds on the huge potential that is there within their own countries, within their own citizens, to properly develop their country, to properly develop a future, a functioning economy. But it requires a complete change in the mindset of some of the rulers, like Abdel Fattah Sisi in Egypt. And then I would say that I hope the equation doesn't become a functioning economy under authoritarian rule, which is somewhat the model that Mohammed bin Salman is putting forward. And to some extent, that's also the model in the United Arab Emirates. Don't talk politics, don't criticize the ruler, but you can have a job and you can have a somewhat free social environment to move in. And in a way, that is something that a lot of people in the rest of the region would aspire to. to just have this sense of peace, this flatlining of their existence, where there are no surprises, there are no wars to wake up to, there are no assassinations to wake up to. But in the long term, again, I don't think that's the model to follow. Although it is also the model that most of the world seems to be going towards, from Hungary to Brazil.
Right, and that's a whole nother pod.
Also
potentially depressing. But let's talk about the positive. I mean, in terms of addressing issues like healthcare, education, are there any countries you think are bright spots?
With all its faults, the United Arab Emirates is a bright spot when it comes to access to education, when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to the basic of having a normal life. But it has many faults. Tunisia, for me, remains a bright spot, an experiment in maturing towards a true democracy with true freedom of expression and gender equality institutionalized in the law, with elections. I mean, the United Arab Emirates has a Ministry of Happiness. You don't really need a Ministry of Happiness if the state and the system provides dignity and justice, and provides a system that is equal for everyone. I always find that to be a little bit of sort of, window dressing, something like a Ministry of Happiness. And then the bright spot for me is the young generation across the region. The young generation who will not give up on trying to fight for a better future, on protesting for the end of corrupt politics, on protesting against sectarian politics, and just not shutting up. From Sudan to Algeria to Lebanon to Iraq to Iran, I find it unbelievable to see how, and even to Syria. Let's not forget Syria. Let's not forget how every time there is a little bit of a moment of quiet in some of the areas in Syria, protests erupt again, calling for the departure of Assad. People are tired of the same old system. And again, we know that the new isn't born, the old isn't dead yet, the new isn't born, and in between it's quite chaotic. And I guess that's the theme of this year, of this new century. But the bright hope in this region really is the younger generation.
Thanks so much for joining us, Kim.
Thanks for having me, Laura.
Till next time. Thank you for listening to The World Unpacked, produced by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We're grateful for your listen and eager for your feedback. We welcome your emails at podcasts@ceip.org. And please rate and review us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find me, Laura Lucas Magnuson, on Twitter, @Laura L. Magnuson. These discussions are only made possible by our wonderful team behind the pod. Our audio engineer is Tim Martin, and our executive producer is Maya Krishna Rogers. We'll see you next time.